This is a prepaid call from an inmate at the Virginia Department of Corrections.
To accept this call, your current balance is $3.29. This call is from a correction facility and is subject to monitoring and recording.
Thank you for using GTL.
Alright, so check this out, man. This is a story about this big Crip that knocked out this Latin King dude over stealing some prayer oil from him. Now, when I say big Crip, let me clarify exactly what I mean. Alright, so this guy, he was nicknamed Debo. You know what I mean? I can only assume he got that name because he looked just like and resembled the character Debo from the movie Friday with Chris Tucker and Ice Cube. Needless to say, the dude was huge, and although he was kind of quiet, he didn't really give off the vibes like he was any kind of pushover. I ran across a whole lot of guys through the course of my bid that are just like big for no reason, so to speak. Real teddy bears is what I like to call them. But this dude, Debo, he was definitely a silverback gorilla, by all means. Matter of fact, he could have been more considered like a gentle giant, for real. That probably would have been a better way to describe him because he wasn't really the type to throw his wit and size around, and be bullying nobody. And he ain't take no advantage of nobody or nothing like that because of his stature or gang status. I ain't never really seen him popping no shit to nobody either. He was always real respectable and polite, at least to me anyway. He ain't really draw in on all that negative energy, and he ain't putting none out neither. Well, with all that said though, as I mentioned, he wasn't by any means a pushover, and he was known to stand on business. Now, Debo, he'd been down for like 15, 16 years already when I met him. Actually, when I met him the second time. So, just like me, he had made his rounds all through the system. Now, I'm not positive, what Crips said he was with. I believe he was either like a rolling 60 or a 30, or even an 8 tray. I'm not sure, one of those. As I mentioned before though, numerous times I don't bang, so I don't really try to keep up with the who's who as far as the sets are concerned. Now don't get me wrong, I know a lot about gangs, the histories, the chain of commands, the signs, and some more shit. Probably a lot more than some of these so-called wannabe gangbangers do about their own gangs in a lot of aspects. And then I happen to know a whole bunch of gangsters and bangers too. I got close friends and partners that's OGs and big homies and everything in between. You understand what I'm saying? I've grown up around and been subjected to and have seen so much gang activity and bullshit that goes on. It's kind of hard not to be aware, as well as knowing some real respectable men and witnessing politics, both inside and outside the system between different gangs that have made humongous differences and changes for the better in a whole lot of ways. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is I ain't new to none of this gang shit. I'm far from naive. Like I said, I got niggas from both coasts and everywhere in between that live that shit for real. They'll die and go to prison for a real long time and a heartbeat behind the shit that they represent. So don't ever get it twisted and think just because I myself don't bang or twist up my fingers and fly rags or claim no sets that I don't know what I'm talking about. Trust and believe. If it's something that I don't know about, then I just won't speak on it until I get the facts. And that's with anything. So just know what comes out of my mouth, you can rest assured is the absolute and undeniable truth. No pun intended on that either, I'm just saying. Anyway, I said all that to say, the dude Debo, he was definitely for real with his shit. You know what I'm saying? Usually most of the Crips that I've met and ran across in the system out here in VA are. And, I mentioned before in the story, I think that, here in Virginia's prison system, especially depending on which prison we're talking about, it's always a decent amount of Crips for sure, but not anywhere near the amount of Bloods that you're going to run across. And that's pretty much everywhere on the whole East Coast, I believe. On the West Coast, it's definitely the opposite. Whereas, it's a whole lot more Crips than there are Bloods. But on the East Coast, the Bloods most certainly got the numbers. Anyway, that's all beside the point. What I'm getting at is the fact that the Latin Kings, they probably one of the smallest and non-existent gangs in the Virginia prison system. Virginia as a whole, for real. I want to say throughout my whole collective 15 plus years in the system, I probably met only about 3 or 4 in total, and that was also on totally separate occasions. And out of that 3 or 4, 2 of them was from New York, particularly the Bronx and Long Island. And they represented what's called the Bloodline, which is a New York-based fraction of the Kings. And one of the dudes that I met, he was out of North Philly. And he represented the KMC, which is based out of Chicago, which is also where the Kings actually originated in the first place. Anyway, my point is, these dudes is highly, highly outnumbered by any and every other gang or group in the system out here in VA. So I don't know what made this particular King nigga think he was going to get away with stealing from another rival gang member. Not to mention, it's always been my understanding that the Crips and the Kings, they always been like arch rivals at that. And they don't get along by no means, at least not supposed to, especially here on the East Coast. It's pretty much the same rivalry that they got with the GDs in the Midwest. Now, I don't want to get, too deep all into that because that's not really what I'm here for. But for those who don't know, just to give y'all a little better understanding of what I mean, you got to realize that when it comes to the Kings and the Vice Lords and even the Bloods for that matter, they rock the 5, which basically means they represented with a 5-point star, which actually makes them allies somewhat. Whereas the GDs, they use a 6-pointed star, with pitchforks and stuff like that for their representation. Well, Crips don't use none of that, So besides the various colors, blue and red, yellow and black, whatever else, the flags and the signs that represent each organization. And unless things on the street change since I've been gone, the rivalries between all of them dates back decades. And then too, it's a pretty fair assumption to note that the rules change a little bit too, depending on which part of the map you in. So, you always got to be aware of where you at. That's key. And what I mean by that is too, the Kings in Chicago, they operate on a totally different type vibe and time than the New York Kings do. Just as the Bloods and the Crips in the West, they function a little different than their counterparts on the East Coast, so forth and so on. And then too, for just as many differences that they all got with each other, a lot of shit is the same too. You understand what I'm saying? And a lot of times, that's why I always say when it comes to these gangs in Virginia, it really gets difficult for me to keep up and take a lot of the shit that I see go on seriously. Because Virginia is not a real natural gang state, for one. A lot of this shit is real watered down, if you ask me. It's a lot of pretend shit and a lot of fugazi shit going on, in the prison system. And in the streets, too, for that matter. But just know, shit could get real in a matter of moments wherever you at. But, a lot of shit can be real questionable, too. And I'm more than sure that Virginia probably ain't the only place that need to be checked. It just so happens that VA is, where I've been for the last 20 plus years. So I've seen it go from bad to worse. Real talk. Anyway, enough about all that. You know what I'm saying? Let me get to how this dude got his head knocked off for stealing. Now, look, if you anything like me, stealing from somebody, no matter who it is, it's probably somewhere in the top 3 for violations. You know what I'm saying? I hate a goddamn thief. On top of that, stealing from somebody in prison to get your ass killed or even hurt up real bad, as in the case with this Latin King. So anyway, about dude, he was a real junkie for one. And he would look for like any and every way to get his next fix or whatever drugs he could get his hands on. Whether that was Suboxone strips, K2, meth, or whatever else. You know what I'm saying? That dude, he was a real jail hustler too. And I ain't gonna front. The nigga had multiple lanes. You understand? He would like wash dishes, he might clean clothes, clean shoes, wash and fold clothes, he sew. He knows how to sew, clean up cells and bunk areas, he cut hair. He was a runner for the parlay guys. And then probably, the most useful hustle he did for everybody was he could basically find you just about anything you wanted or needed. Like for instance, if you needed a pair of headphones, he would find somebody that was selling them. If you needed sneakers, a pair of shorts or some sweats or thermals or whatever, he would find them for you. If you wanted to buy a used TV off the yard instead of from the commissary to save yourself a little bit of money, he'd know where to go and get that. He was a real useful resource to everybody. And although he was a stone cold junkie, most everybody liked him. And they would try to look out for him by supporting his little hustles. Which in turn kind of kept him able to get high as needed. Which is why it baffles me, that he did the dumbass petty shit that he did. So anyway, this particular time, we was in a dorm setting with bunk beds, lined up one after the other along the walls and down the middle of the floor, with approximately about I want to say like 2 feet between each bunk. I mean, it's definitely cramped. You know what I'm saying? It's so goddamn close that you could probably reach over and snatch your neighbor right off his bunk if you wanted to. So I was in the bottom bunk in the back corner of this unit, and the Latin King dude, he's in the top bunk right on top of me, right over me. And the Crip dude, Debo, he sleeps about 4 bunks down from us on the same wall. And he had actually just come to the unit too, maybe like 2 or 3 weeks prior, so he was fairly new to the dorm. You know, although a few of us already in there knew him from other institutions. As I said, Debo had been down for a while. Anyway, as it turns out, you know, he was about to go home. He only had about 3 or 4 months left on his sentence to serve. Now the King dude, like I said, he was a junkie, you know what I'm saying? And he lived like a junkie for the most part. He was one of those guys that would like to stay up all night long, you know, and then he would sleep like the majority of the day. And other than like the bare necessities to live and get by with, he basically didn't own no type of personal property at all. And I say that to say, I used to let him watch my TV, you know, or listen to my music on my tablet at night when I went to bed. So he would have something to keep himself busy and occupied, you know, while doing whatever else he did at night. Just as long as he stayed relatively quiet and didn't allow, you know, nobody else up in the cut when I was asleep. Now, there was other dudes, too, that stayed up all night long in the dorm as well. So a lot of times, you know, they would all gather or congregate at someone else's bunk and just be doing whatever they be doing. So, anyhow, the dude that slept over top of Debo, he was a night owl, too. See, and him and the Latin King dude, they were friends. And they would kick it a lot at night by his bunk. Now, Debo, he ain't seem to mind them dudes being around and whatnot, you know, all up in his cut during the night. So, I can only assume, you know, somebody stealing something from him was the last thing on his mind, or that he thought someone would even try to think of. So anyhow, about these oils, if you don't know how serious it is about the oils, I'm gonna put you on, okay? Now, in prison, prayer oil is a hot commodity, and it's sought after just like any other form of contraband or illegal substance, even though it's not contraband. You know what I mean? I've seen dudes make quite a bit of money selling all kind of oils behind bars, especially if you got some stuff that don't nobody else got. Now, I'm talking about the little bottles of scented oils, you know, that the Nation of Islam guys be selling on street corners, along with their bean pies and Final Call newspapers and stuff like that. Usually in the prison, it's the Sunni Muslims and the NOI that keep most of that type of shit. You understand what I'm saying? And even though, you know, the most common and generic flavors can sometimes be purchased from the commissary, like frankincense or sandalwood, myrrh, stuff like that, a lot of the really good stuff is hard and really next to impossible to get your hands on unless you're connected or know somebody. Now, I know some of you might be thinking to yourself, like, you know, what the fuck is so important about having prayer oil? So, you know, just to be clear, that oil has got many, many purposes. For one, a lot of guys just like to smell good, you know what I'm saying? And dudes will put it on and wear it to their religious service. And especially they might wear it on contact visits with family or girlfriends or wives or what have you. You know, they might use it to freshen up the air in the cell or even try to make incense out of it, you know, to cover up strong odors or some shit like that. I mean, there's a lot of ways, you know, them oils will come in handy, and a lot of reasons why they're so valuable and exclusive behind these walls. Hey, yo, real talk though, you know, just about anything that's not like readily available to the general population becomes more valuable behind bars. That's a fact. And that's why drug prices be through the roof. And niggas can make small fortunes in here in a short period of time off of stuff like tobacco and weed and Suboxone strips, phones and other shit like that. You know, that's just how it is in the prison world. And prayer oil ain't no different. So anyway, you see the dude Debo, he had some oil that ain't nobody else had in the unit at the time. Now that could have been some Egyptian musk or some cool water or some polo red or something else. You know, it really don't matter what it was as long as it smelled good and nobody else had it. See, sometimes dudes might get transferred in from another facility, and when they get to where they're going, they may have certain things in their possession that they acquired in their last facility and nobody else got in the new location. That was the case with Debo and this oil. So as you could imagine, you know, whenever he used to use any of it, dudes would always try to get at him to see if he wanted to sell it, you know, or part with any of it. And he would always turn them down, you know, respectively. Basically keeping his exclusive shit to himself. You know, so anyway, one of those late nights, the Latin King dude is up watching TV with Debo's bunkie in the cut. And I guess he must have already peeped it out earlier that some of his oils was in the wall locker that's attached to the back of the bed. And I guess he thought Debo wouldn't even notice the little bit going out of each bottle. Boy, was he wrong. So look, as I said earlier, dude was a hustler. And I suppose, someone had asked him to see if he could get his hands on some exclusive oils. And I guess the wheels must have started turning, and he figured he just knew the exact place to go and get some. And I guess, everything was going according to his plan for about a day or two, because Debo never did mention anything was missing out of his locker up until that point. Well, all that changed, when the guy that the Latin King sold the little bottles of oil to came to our pod on the humbug, wearing it for one, but then also trying to resell it to one of his homeboys that was in our unit. So his homeboy ends up buying it from him, and then he comes prancing his ass around the pod as if to say, yeah, Debo ain't the only nigga with some exclusive oils. And he's showing it off to everybody, and telling dudes his homeboy in the next building hooked him up and all that. So now it's obvious, that Debo realizes his oil bottles in his locker is looking a little bit light. So he wound up asking dude to let him see and smell the oils that he got, and he inquires the dude who sold it to him and where he got it from. Long story short, he winds up narrowing it down to the hustling junkie Latin King dude. That's all it took. So the very next day, it's about noontime. And as I said, the King nigga, he likes to sleep most of the day. But he got to get up and stand for count time, which is usually about 12:15. So immediately after the count, before dude could even crawl back on the top rack and get under the covers, Debo comes over real aggressive like into the cut that I shared with dude, and immediately makes it known to him that he got an issue that needs to be addressed right now. Now, I'm laying back in my bunk, I'm chilling, I'm waiting on the count to clear, and I'm looking up at both of them, who are now standing in my little 2-foot wide space, and I give them both the look like that basically says, get the fuck out of my area with all of that. I don't even think Debo seen me though. You see, anybody that really knows me knows that I don't like other people, whether it's friends, strangers, neighbors, or whoever in my personal space. Ain't gonna be no playing or standing in, talking to, or dealing with nothing in my personal cut. I gladly get up, step out the cut if you want to talk to me. And that goes for my bunkie too. So immediately, my bunkie, he reads my face, and he calmly asked Debo to allow him to step out the cut to talk about whatever it was that he wanted to address. Now, I don't even think he was totally aware of the aggression, because like I said, he was still basically kind of half asleep. So anyway, Debo allows the dude out the cut, and he winds up confronting him right in the walking aisle directly behind our bunk, which is actually the back corner of the unit. So dude is actually now standing right in front of Debo with his back to a wall and nothing but the small little 2-foot wide space to the right side that's in between the same wall and the other side of our bunk bed. So it's basically nowhere for him to go. So I immediately hear Debo mumble a few words to dude, and then bam, a loud ass pop or crack or smack or some shit. It sounded like a fucking balloon popping. And the Latin King is off his feet and laying out flat on his back in between my bunk and the wall, holding his face. Now Debo's standing on top of him, asking him, what the fuck is wrong with you? And dude is like, nothing. He obviously was in a whole nother world right now. And by that time, another Crip dude had jumped up, basically intervened, and grabbed Debo by the arms and didn't allow him to do nothing else to the boy. At this point, the kid is totally out of it. He ain't in no shape to even defend himself if he wanted to. So Debo then yells out to him so he and everybody else could hear that, he's been locked up over 15 years and ain't never let nobody take shit from him. And he wasn't about to let it start now. Then, he looked at me and he said, yo, my bad, truth, man. I ain't mean to disrespect your area or none of that, but dude is a goddamn thief. So I just looked back up at him, and I was like, shit, no disrespect taken, bro. And that was that. Debo walked down to his bunk, sat back down for a minute to cool off. Now, it took the King nigga about 15 minutes or so to regroup, get himself back together enough to even get to his feet and crawl back into his bed, wrap up and cover up in his blanket. And that's where he laid for like the next 2 days, only getting up to use the bathroom when he needed to. Now, it seemed as if, it was all good and smooth sailing And nothing was going to happen until the third day when the officers actually came around to do a face card count. That's where they want to look at your face and match it to the photo card in their little booklet just to ensure everybody's still in their proper box and in their correct unit. I mean, it's pretty routine, but they just don't do it too often. So, it was just their luck that they decided to do one that day. So when they reached the King dude, that's when they noticed, his face was all swollen and disfigured, and they wound up removing him immediately from the building. And I suppose, it was at that point where they reviewed the cameras and all that and actually seen what took place a couple days prior, and they ain't waste no time coming back to take Debo out the building in cuffs and take him to the hole to lock him up. Now, Debo, he wound up staying in the hole for a couple weeks before they raised the security level and wound up transferring him to a whole other facility. And from what I heard, because of the extent of the damage that he inflicted on that boy's face from just a single punch, the state actually wanted to press charges on him. But the dude that got hit, he held silent, and he wouldn't take no part in it. But you see here in VA, the state will go ahead and press the issue and bring charges even if there ain't no cooperating witnesses, if they feel like circumstances were serious enough and cost them a lot of money. And in some cases, just to avoid being sued by a victim later. Because you see, because the Latin King dude, he wound up having to be taken to a hospital and had to have x-rays done, which basically showed that his eye socket and multiple bones was broken in the left side of his face, and he needed to have surgery to reconstruct it. He actually wound up having to have some kind of metal plate inserted in his face and some dental work done to his jaw. And he had to walk around for weeks with his mouth all wired up, drinking all his meals through a straw. It was like a healing process that took him a few months and numerous trips to the doctors and specialists. And this only really happened like a year ago around this time. I still be seeing dude around and about on the compound sometimes. As a matter of fact, I seen him this morning. And still to this very day, the whole left side of old boy's face is all messed up and disfigured. He kind of looks like it might be permanently swollen, and his eye permanently sunk in his skull with a black ring around it like a raccoon. Now, I gotta say, man, although some niggas said they do, I don't really feel sorry for dude at all. To be honest, I feel like that's what you get for being a damn sneaky ass thief. I feel like he got what was coming to him. And really and truly, he kind of got off easy because that beating could have and should have been a whole lot worse than what he actually got. I really feel sorry for Debo, to be honest. Only because, homeboy put him in that position to have to do something to him. Debo was about to go home in a couple months. And that incident, I'm sure, pushed his release date back a little bit and gave him some more time to serve, plus a fresh case to have to fight and defend himself for. And like I said, from the start, although, Debo was certainly a convict, he wasn't one of those type dudes to bother nobody. You know what I mean? He wasn't in the way, he wasn't looking for no smoke or no trouble from nobody either. He was just trying to finish up his time and make it home. And dude wound up putting him in a situation that's just real hard to overlook, especially in this type of environment. You just can't let shit like that slide. But I'm sure he'll forever be thinking twice from here on out about taking some shit that don't belong to him. Moral to the story though, keep your damn hands to yourself. You know what I'm saying? And don't ever touch or take things that don't belong to you. Well, nobody like a thief, man, especially in prison. Because already ain't got shit for real. The little bit of belongings and personal items that we do own and acquire could very well be protected as if a nigga life depended on it. And not even because of the dollar amount or monetary value either. But just like, Big Worm in the ice cream trucks, also from the movie Friday, would say, it's the principalities of the situation. You understand what I'm saying? And the principles that sometimes play a whole much bigger role and turn a small situation into a huge over-the-top confrontation. And ultimately be the difference in a person's life and death. That's real talk. Take it from me. But shout out to my whole OAP family in Jersey and all my black mob niggas all over, man. Everybody else will be looking forward to hearing me tell these real and true life stories. I got you. Many, many more to come. It's Truth Parker, man. Holla at your motherfucking boy. One.